The 11th Address, Chapter 1, The Digital Ghost. The hum of the refrigerator was the loudest sound in the house. It was a Tuesday, or maybe a Wednesday. The days had started to blur together, each one a pale copy of the last, marked only by the rigid schedule of pills and meals. Clara May Thompson sat at the small kitchen desk, the glow of the laptop screen casting long shadows across her tired face. She was 71, but some mornings she felt closer to 100. Outside, Boise, Idaho, was waking up to a crisp autumn morning. The leaves on the maple tree in their front yard were a fiery explosion of red and orange. Frank had always loved that tree. He'd planted it the year they moved in, a skinny sapling that had grown strong and sturdy, much like their marriage. Or so she had always believed. Frank was in the living room, settled in his worn leather armchair, a thick woolen blanket draped over his legs. From the kitchen, she could see the back of his head, the silver hair thin now. He was quiet. He was always quiet these days. Parkinson's disease had stolen his voice, his mobility, his memories. It was a thief in the night, this illness, creeping in slowly and taking things one by one, so gradually you almost didn't notice until you woke up one day and found the house of your life ransacked, the most precious valuables gone. Today's task was digital housekeeping. An email from their bank about suspicious activity on an old credit card had sent her down a rabbit hole of online accounts, passwords, and security questions she hadn't thought about in years. Frank, a former civil engineer, had been meticulous, organized, but his digital world, like his physical one, had been left untended as his mind and body failed him. She was logged into his old OmniBuy account. It was the website they'd used for everything from books to garden tools for the better part of 2 decades. Her goal was simple: update the payment methods, delete the old ones, and maybe close the account for good. They didn't need it anymore. Her weekly trips to the supermarket were all the shopping they did. She navigated to the account settings. Name: Frank Thompson. Primary address: 1422 Willow Creek Lane, Boise, ID. She smiled faintly. Willow Creek. It had sounded so romantic when they bought the house 50 years ago. Now it just sounded old. She clicked on Your Addresses. The page loaded and a list appeared. And that's when the quiet, predictable rhythm of her Tuesday shattered. There was their home address, of course, at the top, but below it were others. 18 Elm Street, Portland, Oregon. 450 Ocean View Drive, Apartment 3B, Crescent City, California. 733 Pioneer Square, Seattle, Washington. And on and on. Her breath caught in her throat. She scrolled down. 4, 5, 8, 11. There were 11 addresses in total, archived but still there, a digital ghost of journeys she knew nothing about. They were scattered across the Pacific Northwest, Oregon, Washington, Northern California. Places they had visited together, yes, but these specific streets, these house numbers, were alien to her. Her heart began to beat a frantic, panicked rhythm against her ribs. What was this? An error? A glitch in the system? She clicked on the order history, her fingers trembling slightly. She filtered by one of the strange addresses: Portland. Order date: June 12, 2015. Item: Lego Star Wars Millennium Falcon set. Delivered to 18 Elm Street, Portland, Oregon. Order date: December 5th, 2014. Item: Professional Artist's Easel and Oil Paint Set. Delivered to 18 Elm Street, Portland, Oregon. Order date, May 21st, 2013. Item: advanced drone with camera. Delivered to 18 Elm Street, Portland, Oregon. Expensive toys. Hobbies. For whom? She checked another address. Crescent City. Order date, September 3rd, 2011. Item: the collected works of Jane Austen, leather-bound edition. Delivered to 450 Ocean View Drive, Apartment 3B, Crescent City, California. Order date, February 14th, 2010. Item: a silver locket necklace. Delivered to 450 Ocean View Drive, Apartment 3B, Crescent City, California. A silver locket. On Valentine's Day, a cold dread, sharp and sickening, seeped into her bones. The hum of the refrigerator was no longer a comforting domestic sound. It was a low, mocking drone. 50 years of marriage, 50 years of shared breakfasts, of holding hands in the dark at the movies, of raising a daughter, of celebrating triumphs and weathering storms. 50 years of what she had thought was complete and unwavering trust. Had it all been a lie? Her mind, a practical nurse's mind, trained to diagnose symptoms, raced through the possibilities. An affair? A long-term secret relationship? A whole other life, lived in the margins of their own? The dates spanned nearly 20 years. The last one was from 3 years ago, just before Frank had his last major decline. The one that took his ability to use a computer. The one that locked him away inside himself for good. He had a secret, a big one, and he had taken it with him into the silent prison of his illness, leaving her alone with the evidence. She looked from the glowing screen to the still figure in the living room. His name was Frank. He was her husband. He was the man who could never remember their anniversary, but would show up with her favorite wildflowers on a random Tuesday, just because he saw them at the market. He was the man who had held her hand for 48 hours straight, when their daughter, Sarah, had pneumonia as a child. He was the man who, even now, in his fog, would sometimes reach for her hand, his grip weak but insistent. Who was he? The question echoed in the sudden, vast emptiness of her kitchen. She had thought she knew, but the screen in front of her, with its 11 silent addresses, suggested she didn't know him at all. The quiet man in the other room was a stranger. And Clara Mae Thompson, for the first time in a half-century, was utterly and terrifyingly alone. Her life, the one she had so carefully built and maintained, had just become a mystery, and she was the only one left to solve it. Chapter 2: The Road to Elm Street. For 2 days, the list of addresses burned in her mind. It was a constant, humming presence behind her thoughts as she went through the motions of their life. Spoon-feeding Frank his oatmeal, changing the channel on the television, sorting the laundry. Every mundane task was tainted by the silent scream of the unknown. Who lived at 18 Elm Street? Who wore the silver locket from Crescent City? Sleep offered no escape. She'd lie awake in the dark, the space beside her in the bed feeling vast and cold, even though Frank was right there, his breathing a shallow, rhythmic whisper. She'd stare at the ceiling and see the addresses scrolling behind her eyes like some cruel digital news ticker, announcing the ruin of her life. The most obvious answer was the most painful. Infidelity. A secret family. It was the stuff of daytime television, of sensational news articles. It wasn't the stuff of her life. Their life. Frank was Frank. Solid, dependable, quietly romantic. He wasn't a man of grand passions or dark secrets. He was an engineer. He built bridges. He believed in solid foundations, in things that lasted. But the evidence was undeniable. 11 addresses, gifts, a locket. By the third morning, she knew she couldn't live with the not knowing. The uncertainty was a cancer, eating away at the foundations of her memory, of her entire past. She had to know the truth, even if it was the worst thing she could imagine. She made a decision. It felt rash, reckless, something a younger, more impulsive woman would do. She was going to go to the first address, the one in Portland. Arrangements had to be made. She called her daughter, Sarah, who lived in Salt Lake City. "Mom, is everything okay? You never call this early." Clara forced her voice to be steady, cheerful. "Everything's fine, honey. Just fine. Listen, I was thinking, I need a little break. My old friend, Martha, from nursing school, she lives in Portland. I was thinking of driving up to see her for a couple of days." A lie. Martha had passed away 5 years ago. But Sarah didn't need to know that. "Oh, Mom, that's a great idea. You deserve it. But what about Dad?" "I've called the respite care agency. They have a wonderful woman, Agnes, who can stay here for 2 nights. She's been here before, remember? Dad likes her." Another half-truth. Agnes had been there once, and Frank hadn't seemed to notice her presence at all. But it was enough. Sarah was convinced. "Okay, Mom, that's really good. I'm glad you're doing something for yourself. Call me when you get there." "Of course, sweetie. I love you." "Love you too, Mom." Hanging up the phone, a wave of guilt washed over her, lying to her own daughter. But what was the alternative? "Sarah, honey, I think your father, the man who is currently unable to feed himself, may have been leading a double life for 20 years, and I'm driving to Oregon to confront a potential mistress." It was unthinkable. The drive to Portland was a 5-hour blur of highways and changing landscapes. The familiar golden hills of Idaho gave way to the dense green forests of Oregon. Clara drove her sturdy 10-year-old sedan, the car they'd bought for their retirement. For road trips, they'd had so many plans. The Grand Canyon, the national parks. But Frank's illness had put an end to all that. The car, like her, felt like it was made for a journey that had been canceled. With every mile that passed, her resolve wavered. One moment, she was a woman on a righteous quest for truth. The next, she was a foolish old woman chasing ghosts, about to make a terrible mistake and intrude on a stranger's life. What would she even say? "Hello, my name is Clara, and I believe my husband has been sending you packages for years. Would you mind telling me why?" She pulled off the highway at a rest stop just outside the city. Her hands were shaking. She gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white. Maybe she should just turn back, go home, delete the addresses from the OmniBuy account and from her memory. Pretend she never saw them. She could live in ignorance. It would be a lie, but it might be a kinder reality than the truth. She thought of Frank, of the man she married. A man who had once designed a bridge so elegant, so perfectly balanced, that it won him a prestigious award. He'd been so proud, he'd called it the Clara May Arch. He said it was because she was his support, the thing that held him up. Was that a lie too? Was he building other bridges for other people all this time? No, she couldn't go back. She had to know who he was, who they were. She took a deep breath, put the car in drive, and merged back onto the highway. Elm Street was a quiet, tree-lined road in a modest, older neighborhood of Portland. The houses were small, well-kept bungalows with neat little gardens. It didn't look like the setting for a sordid affair. It looked normal. She found number 18. It was a pale blue house with white trim and a porch swing. A profusion of late-blooming roses climbed a trellis by the door. She parked across the street, her heart pounding. For a long time, she just sat there, watching the house, as if the truth might simply emerge from it and present itself. Finally, she got out of the car. Her legs felt weak, unsteady. She walked up the concrete path to the front door. The air smelled of damp earth and roses. She raised her hand, her fist hovering in front of the wood for a full 10 seconds before she found the strength to knock. The door opened. A woman stood there, about her own age, with sharp, intelligent eyes and gray hair pulled back in a loose bun. She wore an apron dusted with what looked like flour. She was wiping her hands on a dish towel. "Yes?" the woman asked, her voice neutral but her eyes wary. Clara's carefully rehearsed speech evaporated. All the words she'd practiced vanished, leaving only raw, clumsy fear. "Hello," she began, her voice thin. "My name is Clara Thompson. I'm looking for... I think you may have known my husband, Frank Thompson." The woman's expression hardened instantly. The neutrality vanished, replaced by a cold, defensive mask. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice dropping. "I think you have the wrong house." She started to close the door. Panic seized Clara. "No, please," she said, louder than she intended. "Please, just wait. He lived in Boise, an engineer. He sent things here, to this address, for years." The woman stopped, her hand on the doorknob. She stared at Clara, a long, searching look. Clara could see a flicker of something in her eyes. Recognition? Confusion? "Who are you again?" the woman asked, her tone still suspicious. "I'm his wife," Clara whispered. The words felt strange, heavy. His wife of 50 years. The woman, whose name Clara would learn was Eleanor Vance, stared at her for a moment longer. Then, with a deep, weary sigh, she opened the door wider. "You'd better come in," she said. The house inside was cozy, filled with the smell of baking bread. But Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. She had crossed a threshold. There was no going back now. The story of Frank's secret life was about to begin. Chapter 3. The Weight of a Bridge. The woman, Eleanor, led Clara into a small, sunlit living room. It was filled with books and handmade quilts. On the mantelpiece, amidst family photos, sat a stunningly intricate model of the Millennium Falcon. The Lego set from the Omnibuy order. Seeing it in person, a real object in a real home, made the digital list feel terrifyingly concrete. "Please, sit," Eleanor said, gesturing to an armchair. She didn't sit herself, but stood by the fireplace, her arms crossed, a sentinel in her own home. "So, you're Frank's wife?" "Yes," Clara said, her voice barely a whisper. She felt like an intruder, a detective, a fool. I don't understand. I found this address, in his records. He sent things here." Eleanor let out a short, humorless laugh. "He did that all right. For years. Like clockwork. Birthdays, Christmas, sometimes for no reason at all." Clara's stomach twisted. Who were they for? Eleanor's gaze softened slightly, the hard edges of her suspicion beginning to fray. She looked at Clara, truly looked at her, and seemed to see not a threat, but another woman, lost and confused. "They were for my grandson, Leo," she said, quietly. "Your grandson?" Clara was stunned. She had braced herself for a mistress, a secret love child, not a grandchild. Yes, Leo is 16 now. He's on the autism spectrum. He doesn't connect with people easily, but he connects with things, systems, intricate models. Frank sent him his first big Lego set when he was 7. It was the first time I saw Leo focus on something for more than 5 minutes. It was a miracle. Clara's mind was reeling. This wasn't a story of betrayal. It was something else, something she couldn't begin to grasp. But why? Why would Frank send gifts to your grandson? Did he know him? Eleanor finally sat down on the sofa opposite Clara. She looked down at her hands, her fingers tracing the pattern on her flour-dusted apron. No, she said. He never met Leo. He knew my brother, David. David? The name meant nothing to Clara. She had prided herself on knowing Frank's colleagues, his friends. She'd hosted countless dinner parties, remembered names and faces. But David, there was no David. David Vance, my brother, Eleanor said, her voice heavy with a grief that time had softened, but not erased. He was an iron worker. He worked with your husband back in the late 70s. They were building the St. John's Bridge, the big one, just outside the city. Clara remembered that project. Frank had been a junior engineer then. It was a difficult, dangerous job. He'd come home late every night, exhausted, covered in grime, his face etched with a stress he rarely spoke of. David, he fell, Eleanor said, her voice catching. A cable snapped. There was an investigation. They called it an accident, a tragic, unavoidable accident. But David had told me he was worried. He said they were cutting corners, rushing things to stay on schedule. He said Frank Thompson, the young engineer, was under a lot of pressure from the higher-ups. A cold dread washed over Clara. She remembered that time. A man had died. Frank had been devastated. He'd shut down completely for weeks. He wouldn't talk about it, not even to her. He'd attended the funeral, a grim, silent figure in a black suit. She had thought it was the shock of witnessing a death. She'd never imagined it was anything more. Frank blamed himself, Eleanor continued, her voice flat. I saw him at the funeral. The look on his face. It wasn't just grief. It was guilt. Raw, consuming guilt. He tried to give me money then, for David's wife and my then newborn son. I was insulted. I thought he was trying to buy his way out of his responsibility. I yelled at him. I told him to get out and never come back. I told him his money was tainted. She paused, looking up at Clara, her eyes filled with a complicated mix of old anger and new understanding. He respected my wishes. He never came back. He never contacted me again, not directly. But 20 years later, after my own son had passed and I was raising his boy, Leo, the packages started arriving. No note, no name, just a gift for a boy he'd never met. His way of, I don't know, atoning, making amends? It was his silent apology, sent across the decades. The room was silent, save for the ticking of a grandfather clock in the hall. Clara felt like the wind had been knocked out of her. This wasn't a story of infidelity. It was a story of a burden, a secret guilt Frank had carried, alone, for over 40 years. He had never told her. He had carried this immense weight in silence, trying to balance the scales in his own quiet way. I never knew, Clara whispered, tears welling in her eyes. He never told me he felt responsible. He was a proud man, Eleanor said softly. And a good one, I think. Misguided, maybe. He should have talked to someone, to you. But he did what he thought was right, in his own way. She gestured towards the Millennium Falcon. Leo loves these things. They've given him a focus, a joy I couldn't always provide. In a way, your husband helped raise my grandson." Clara looked at this woman, this stranger, who held a piece of her husband's soul that she had never been allowed to see. There was no jealousy, only a profound, aching sadness. Sadness for the man who felt so alone in his guilt, and sadness for herself, for the wife who had lived alongside him, completely unaware of the battles he was fighting within himself. She had come to Portland expecting to find a wound, a betrayal. Instead, she had found a scar, a deep, old scar on her husband's heart that he had spent a lifetime trying to heal in secret. As she drove away from Elm Street, the fiery colors of the autumn leaves seemed sharper, more poignant. The world felt different, more complex. She had answers to her first question, but now she had 100 more. One address down, 10 to go. Her journey was just beginning. She wasn't just uncovering Frank's secrets anymore. She was rediscovering the man she had married. Chapter 4: The Woman by the Sea. The drive south from Portland was a pilgrimage into the unknown. Clara followed the coastline, the vast gray expanse of the Pacific Ocean on her right, a constant, sighing companion. The landscape was dramatic, all jagged cliffs and churning surf, a reflection of the turmoil in her own heart. Her next destination was Crescent City, California, a small, rugged town tucked just below the Oregon border. The address was 450 Ocean View Drive, apartment 3B. The orders sent here were different. Not toys for a child, but books and a silver locket for Valentine's Day. This one still felt personal, dangerous. The specter of a romantic affair, which had been banished in Eleanor Vance's cozy living room, crept back into the car with her. She found the apartment building. It was a slightly weathered, 3-story structure that had clearly seen better days. The sea air had streaked the paint and rusted the railings. It had the transient, lonely feel of a place where people didn't put down deep roots. She climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor, her footsteps echoing in the salty air. Apartment 3B. She knocked, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. The door was opened by a woman who looked to be in her late 60s. She was thin and frail, with flyaway white hair and eyes the color of a faded summer sky. She leaned on a walker, but her gaze was direct, curious. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice soft and breathy. "I hope so," Clara began, her voice steadier this time. "My name is Clara Thompson. I'm from Boise. I was wondering if you knew a man named Frank Thompson." The woman's pale eyes widened. A delicate, trembling hand went to her mouth. She didn't look angry or defensive like Eleanor. She looked haunted. "Frankie," she whispered, using a name Clara hadn't heard in 50 years. "Oh my word, Frankie Thompson." She beckoned Clara inside. The apartment was tiny, cluttered but clean. Every surface was covered with plants. Ferns, orchids, succulents. It was like a miniature jungle. And the air was thick with the scent of damp earth and blooming flowers. "I'm sorry, my dear, I'm Genevieve," the woman said, slowly making her way to a small armchair. "Please, forgive me. You've given me quite a shock. I haven't heard that name spoken aloud in decades." Clara sat on a small stool, surrounded by leaves. "You knew him." It wasn't a question. "Knew him?" Genevieve gave a small, sad smile. "My dear, he was my first love. My only real love, if I'm being honest." The words hit Clara like a physical blow. So, this was it. The other woman. She felt the air leave her lungs, a cold knot forming in her stomach. "We grew up together, Back in a little town in eastern Oregon, Genevieve continued, her eyes distant, lost in a past Clara had no part in. We were inseparable. We were going to get married, run away to the city. We had our whole lives planned out under the stars. She sighed. But life happens. My father got sick. I had to stay and take care of him. Frank went off to college to study engineering. He promised he'd wait. He promised he'd come back for me. Her gaze drifted to the window, to the gray ocean beyond. He wrote at first, passionate, beautiful letters, but they became less frequent. I was so busy, so tired. I didn't always write back. And then they stopped. I heard through a friend that he'd met someone else, a nurse, that he was getting married. She looked at Clara, and there was no malice in her eyes, only a deep, ancient sadness. He met you. Clara felt a flush of shame, of guilt. She was the other woman in this story. She was the one who had come along and broken the promise. I didn't know, she stammered. He never spoke of you. He wouldn't have, Genevieve said. Frankie was always one to carry his burdens silently. He wasn't one to dwell on the past. He was always looking forward, building the next thing. She gestured around the apartment. I, on the other hand, I live in the past. It's cozier there. He sent you things, Clara said, the words feeling clumsy. Books, a locket. Genevieve's face lit up. She reached for a thin silver chain around her neck, pulling out a small, simple locket from beneath her blouse. It was the locket from the omnibuy order. This, yes, she said, her fingers stroking the cool metal. It arrived one day out of the blue. No note. I knew it was from him. It's a habit of his. She opened the locket. We grew up together back in a little town in eastern Oregon. We were inseparable. We were going to get married, run away to the city. He sent you things in the omnibuy order, but you're not from here. You haven't bought the books yet, she said. Frankie married me. I didn't think about it that way, but I promised he'd wait. He promised he'd come back for me. I didn't know if it better beyond this. He knew it better than anyone. We had our whole lives planned out under the stars. She gestured around the apartment. I knew it was from him. It's a habit of his. He promised he'd wait. He promised he'd come back for me. Inside, there were no pictures, just a tiny, perfectly preserved four-leaf clover. It was his good luck charm. He gave it to me the day he left for college. Clara stared at the locket, at this tiny, intimate piece of a history she never knew existed. And the books? She asked. Ah, the books, Genevieve smiled. After my late husband left me, I was in a bad way. He took everything. I had nothing. I had to sell my home, my belongings. The one thing that gave me comfort was my botany, my plants. I've always loved them. One day a book arrived, a rare, expensive guide to orchids, then another on ferns, and another on coastal flora. They just appeared. For years. They were my education. They were my lifeline. They allowed me to build this little world for myself. She looked at Clara. her faded blue eyes full of a strange, gentle pity. "He never forgot me, you see, but not in the way you're thinking. I read his obituary online, you know? When my husband passed, I saw his picture. He had a good life, a wife, a daughter. I was happy for him. Frank was a good man. He deserved a good life." She paused. "But I think he always carried a little piece of guilt for how things ended between us, for the letters that stopped. He was a man who felt the weight of his own promises. These gifts, they weren't for a lover. They were for a friend he felt he had abandoned." It was his way of saying, "I'm sorry. I hope you're okay." Clara sat in silence, the scent of orchids filling her lungs. The story was so different, so much more complicated than she could have imagined. Frank hadn't been pining for a lost love. He had been tending to a memory, trying to offer a form of support he could no longer give in person. It was an act of quiet compassion, a thread of connection maintained across 50 years of silence. "He's not well." It was his way of saying, "I'm sorry, and hope you're okay." Clara sat inside. Clara found herself saying, "He has Parkinson's. He can't talk anymore, or remember things." Genevieve's eyes filled with tears. "Oh, that brilliant mind," she whispered. "That kind, quiet man. I'm so sorry, my dear. I am so, so sorry." In that tiny, cluttered apartment overlooking the sea, two women who had loved the same man cried together. They cried for the boy he had been, for the man he had become, and for the man he was now, lost in the fog of his illness. "He never forgot me, you see, but not in the way you're thinking." Clara had come looking for a rival, a ghost from the past who threatened her present. Instead, she found an ally, a fellow keeper of Frank's memory. When she left Genevieve's apartment, Clara walked down to the beach. She took off her shoes and stood at the edge of the surf, the cold water washing over her feet. The ocean was vast, endless, full of secrets and hidden depths. Just like her husband, just like their marriage. He was a quiet ending to his life. He never forgot me, you see. But not in the way you're thinking. He had always wanted me. He built a life filled with quiet compassion and wonder. She had been married to a man who contained multitudes she never knew. A man who felt the weight of a fallen colleague, the sting of a broken promise to a first love. He had never burdened her with these things. He had chosen to carry them alone. Was it a betrayal to keep such secrets? Or was it a kindness? A misguided attempt to protect her from his own private sorrows? She didn't have the answer. But as she watched the sun begin to set, she had been married. Actually married. She had been married to a man who contained multitudes she never knew. A man who felt the weight of a fallen colleague, the sting of a broken promise to a first love. He had never burdened her with these things. He had chosen to carry them alone. Was it a betrayal? Or was it a kindness? A misguided attempt to protect her from his own private sorrows. Casting a golden path across the water, she felt a profound shift within herself. The anger was gone, replaced by a deep, aching love for the complex, flawed, beautiful man she was only just beginning to know. And she knew, with absolute certainty, that she had to keep going. She had to uncover all of his stories. She had to know him completely for both of them. Chapter 5: The Architect of Second Chances. The next address took Clara inland. At the beach, she felt the presence of love and compassion for the special man she was carrying. And when the moon began to set, she looked at Clara. The light shone all around her. It was his way of saying, "I'm sorry. I hope you're okay." She didn't have the answer. But as she watched the sun begin to set, she felt a profound shift within herself. The anger was gone, replaced by a deep, aching love for the complex, flawed, beautiful man she was on away from the coast and into the bustling heart of Seattle. 733 Pioneer Square. This wasn't a residential address, but a business, a high-end art gallery. The orders sent here were varied: a professional potter's wheel, expensive German-made carving tools, a large, professional-grade kiln. These weren't sentimental gifts. And no, when you ever pass away, send away anger. Knowing that, if he never turned to his memory, does that mean he will never forgive her? And no, when you ever pass away, send away anger. Ale, you may know by this saying, you do not know what happened and what you had cherished or honored will never satisfy you. They were serious, professional equipment. Clara felt a different kind of apprehension this time. This wasn't about guilt or lost love. This felt like an investment. Was Frank secretly a patron of the arts? It seemed unlikely. Frank's idea of art was a well-designed blueprint, the elegant curve of a concrete arch. The gallery was a chic, minimalist space with white walls and polished concrete floors. Abstract sculptures stood like silent sentinels, and vast, challenging paintings hung in stark arrangements. A young woman with sharp black-framed glasses and an asymmetrical haircut approached her. "May I help you?" she asked, her tone cool and professional. "I hope so," Clara said. "I'm looking for the owner. My name is Clara Thompson." The young woman's demeanor changed. "Oh, Mrs. Thompson, of course, Mr. Chen will want to see you. Right this way." She led Clara through the gallery to a sleek back office. A man in his late 40s, with a kind face and a calm, centered presence, rose from behind a large glass desk. "Mrs. Thompson," he said, extending a hand. "I'm Michael Chen. It's an honor to finally meet you. Your husband, he is a great man." Clara was taken aback. "You know Frank?" "I know of him," Michael corrected gently. "I never had the privilege of meeting him in person, but he changed my life. Please, sit." He told her his story. His father had owned a small construction company that had worked as a subcontractor for Frank's firm many years ago. There had been a dispute over a contract. A mistake had been made. Michael wasn't sure by whom, and his father's company had been ruined. They lost everything. The shame and stress led his father to an early grave. "I was a teenager," Michael said, his voice quiet. "I was angry. I hated your husband. I blamed him for everything. I dropped out of school, got into trouble. I was on a very bad path." He paused, looking around his beautiful gallery. "Then one day, a package arrived for me. It was a block of modeling clay and a cheap set of sculpting tools. There was no note. I had no idea who it was from, but I was bored and I had nothing else to do. So I started to play with it, and I discovered I had a talent. I wasn't just good at it. I was alive when I was doing it." Over the years, the anonymous gifts continued. A better set of tools, books on sculpture, then a gift certificate to a local art class. Each one was a nudge, a gentle push in the right direction. "It was your husband," Michael said, his voice thick with emotion. "I figured it out years later. I did some research, found a connection. He was undoing the damage he felt he'd caused. He didn't just ruin my father's business. He felt he'd ruined my future. So he decided to build me a new one." He leaned forward, his eyes shining. "This gallery? It was built on his foundation. The big kiln in my studio, the one that lets me fire the large pieces that have made my reputation, he sent it. He didn't just give me a hobby, Mrs. Thompson. He gave me a life. He gave me a second chance." Clara was speechless. Frank, the engineer, the man of right angles and stress calculations, had been a secret architect of human lives. He saw a crack in a foundation, a family ruined, a boy going astray, and he didn't just patch it. He quietly, painstakingly built something new and beautiful in its place. She left the gallery and wandered through Pioneer Square, watching the city life swirl around her. She was beginning to see a pattern, a unifying theory behind Frank's secret life. He was a builder. It was the core of his identity. And when he felt he had broken something, a company, a friendship, a young boy's future, he felt a profound, structural need to make it right, not with apologies or words, which he was never good at, but with tangible actions, with tools, with books, with Legos. He was sending the raw materials for a new construction. The next few addresses she didn't visit in person. She didn't need to. She understood the language now. She made phone calls, did research online. An address in a small Oregon town led her to the story of a family whose farm Frank's firm had acquired through eminent domain for a highway project decades ago. Frank had anonymously sent them packages of rare, heirloom seeds every spring, allowing them to start a small, successful organic market garden on their new, smaller plot of land. An address in a suburb of Tacoma belonged to a man who had been Frank's fiercest rival in college. The man had fallen on hard times, suffering from a debilitating illness. Frank had been sending him subscriptions to engineering journals and expensive, cutting-edge drafting software for years, not as charity, but as a sign of respect, a way of saying, "You are still in the game." Each story was a new brushstroke, adding depth and color to the portrait of her husband that was emerging in her mind. He was a man of deep, abiding conscience, a man who kept a silent ledger of his own perceived debts and spent his life meticulously, secretly paying them off. But with this new understanding came a new, painful question. She understood his guilt towards strangers, towards people he had wronged in his professional life. But what about her? Where did she fit into this secret world of atonement? Was their life together the one true, solid thing in his life? Or was it just another project, another structure that required secret maintenance she knew nothing about? There were still a few addresses left on the list. One in particular gnawed at her. It was in a tiny, remote town in the mountains of Northern California, and the name associated with it was a man she knew, a man from her own past with Frank. It was the address that she feared most of all, because this story wasn't just about Frank. It was about them. Chapter 6: The Man on the Mountain. The town of Weaverville, California, was nestled deep in the Trinity Alps, a place of rugged, breathtaking beauty and profound isolation. The drive there was long and winding, the road climbing higher and higher into a world of pine forests and sharp granite peaks. This was the journey Clara had been dreading. The name on this address was Arthur Vance. No relation to Eleanor in Portland, but a name that echoed with a painful resonance from her and Frank's shared past. Arthur had been Frank's first business partner. They had started their own small engineering firm right after Frank left the big company, full of youthful ambition and grand ideas. Arthur was the charismatic one, the salesman. Frank was the genius, the quiet, brilliant designer. And Clara? Clara had been in the middle. Arthur had been a friend of her family's. He had introduced her to Frank. For a brief, confusing time, Arthur had been interested in her too. He was charming, funny, and exciting, but she had chosen Frank. His stillness, his depth, his quiet integrity. It was a choice she had never once regretted. The partnership had dissolved acrimoniously after only a few years. There had been a major disagreement over a project, a bridge design. Arthur had wanted to use a cheaper, faster method. Frank had insisted it was unsafe. The argument had been monumental. Arthur had accused Frank of being overly cautious, of holding the business back. Frank had accused Arthur of being reckless. In the end, they had split. Arthur had gone on to a moderately successful career. Frank had struggled for years to rebuild his reputation, a cloud of doubt hanging over him. The address led her to a small cabin set back from the main road, smoke curling from its stone chimney. A tired-looking pickup truck was parked outside. As she approached, an old, grizzled man with a thick white beard and sharp, weary eyes came out onto the porch. It was Arthur. He looked older, weathered by the mountain and by life, but she recognized him instantly. "Clara May," he said, his voice a low rumble of disbelief. "What in God's name are you doing here?" "Hello, Arthur," she said, her voice small against the vast mountain silence. "I came to ask you about Frank." Arthur's face darkened. He gestured to a rocking chair on the porch. "Figured this day would come, sooner or later. Sit down. This is going to take a while." She sat, and Arthur told her the story of the bridge, the one that had broken their partnership. "He was right, you know," Arthur said, staring out at the trees. "Frank's design was better, safer. My way was cheaper, yeah, but there was a flaw in the calculations, a small one, easy to miss. But Frank saw it. He knew it could lead to a catastrophic failure down the line, maybe 10, 20 years later. A stress fracture under the right conditions." He shook his head, a look of old shame on his face. "I wouldn't listen. I called him a coward. Said he was afraid to take a risk. We fought. I told him I was taking my half of the company and building that bridge my way, with or without him." He looked at Clara, his eyes pleading for an understanding she wasn't sure she could give. "Here's the part you don't know, Clara May. The part Frank made me swear I'd never tell. To save me, to save the project and the investors, Frank did something unbelievable. He publicly took responsibility for my flawed design. He wrote a report saying he had rechecked my numbers and approved them. He put his name, his reputation, and my mistake. Then secretly, using his own money, he paid the contractor to use a stronger grade of steel to reinforce the very stress points he was worried about. It nearly bankrupted him. He fixed my mistake in secret while publicly taking the fall for it." Clara felt the porch tilt beneath her. The story she had known for 40 years, that Frank had been too cautious, that Arthur had been the ambitious one, was a complete fabrication, a lie Frank had constructed to save his friend. "Why?" Clara whispered. "Why would he do that?" Arthur let out a long, slow breath. "Because the week we had that fight, my wife had just been diagnosed with cancer. We had a new baby. If the firm went under, if I was disgraced, we would have lost everything. Frank knew that, so he sacrificed himself. He took the blame so I could keep my career, my insurance, my house. He let the world think he was the failure so that I could survive. The packages Frank had sent to Arthur over the years, they weren't acts of atonement or forgiveness. They were something else." "He sent you things, didn't he?" Clara asked. "Tools, blueprints." Arthur nodded, a tear tracing a path through the weathered lines of his face. "Every year, a new T-square, a set of drafting pens, the latest engineering software. It was his way of saying, 'You're still a builder.'" He let the world think he was the failure so that I could survive. The packages Frank had sent to Arthur over the years, they weren't acts of atonement or forgiveness. They were something else. He sent you things, didn't he? Clara asked. Tools, blueprints, the latest engineering. Don't you dare give up. He was holding thee accountable to the second chance he gave me. The silence on the mountain was absolute. Clara looked at this old, broken man and saw the immense, terrible cost of her husband's secret compassion. Frank hadn't just carried guilt. He had carried other people's failures. He had quietly, deliberately taken their burdens onto his own shoulders and borne their weight in silence. There's one more thing you should know, Arthur said. His voice hoarse, about why he chose you. I was a fool for you, Clara May. We both were. I was loud about it. I tried to charm you. But Frank saw you. He told me once, Arthur, you see Clara as a beautiful thing to be won. I see her as a place to be safe. He loved you with a depth I couldn't even comprehend. Everything he did, every bridge he built, every sacrifice he made, it was all anchored to you. You were his foundation. You can't do it to Arthur. Don't you dare give up. He let the world think he was the failure. That Arthur had been the ambitious one was a complete fabrication. A lie Frank had constructed to save his friend. Frank didn't just carry guilt. He had carried other. He protected you from all this because he didn't want any of his burdens to weaken the most important structure he ever built. Clara stood up, her legs trembling. She had to go. She had to get back to Boise, back to Frank. She finally understood. His silence wasn't a wall to keep her out. He sacrificed you from all this because he didn't want any of his burdens to weaken the most important structure he ever built. He protected you from all this because he didn't want any of his burdens to weaken the most important structure he ever built. And now, he protected you from all this because he didn't want any of his burdens to weaken the most important structure he ever built. He protected you from all this because he didn't want any of his. It was a shield to keep the world's ugliness and his own perceived failures away from her. He hadn't been living a secret life separate from her. He had been living a secret life for her. As she drove down the mountain, leaving Arthur and his ghosts behind, she realized the nature of her journey had changed again. She was no longer just an investigator. She was a witness. The sole witness to the true measure of a man who was now unable to testify for himself. There was only one address left: a post office box in their own city, Boise, Idaho. The final secret was waiting for her at home. Chapter 7. The 11th Address. The final leg of her journey was the shortest in distance, but the longest in emotional wait. Driving back into Boise, the familiar streets looked alien, transformed by the knowledge she now carried. The city was no longer just her home. It was the epicenter of Frank's secret geography of kindness and regret. There was only one address left: a post office box in their own city, Boise, Idaho. The final leg of her journey was the shortest in distance, but the longest in emotional wait. Driving back into Boise, the familiar streets looked alien. The 11th address was not a house or a business. It was a P.O. box at the main downtown post office. It felt anticlimactic, impersonal. But after everything she had learned, Clara knew that the simplest facades often concealed the deepest truths. She didn't know if she could get access to it, but she had to try. In Frank's old roll-top desk, a piece of furniture she hadn't touched in years, she rummaged through drawers filled with blueprints, slide rules. In Frank's old roll-top desk, a piece of furniture she hadn't touched in years, she rummaged through drawers filled with blueprints, slide rules, camera phone, and grates. When she wanted to reach Frank again, it was a handful of empty post offices and the detritus of a long career. And there, in a small lacquered box where he kept his drafting compasses, she found it. A small, simple key, attached to a brass tag with a number stamped on it. The number of the P.O. box. The post office was a grand old building of marble and brass. It felt like a temple. She walked to the wall of small square doors, her heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm. She found the number. Her hand trembled as she inserted the key. It turned smoothly. The number of the P.O. box, filled with blueprints. The post office was a grand old building of marble and brass. It felt like a temple. She walked to the wall of small square doors, her heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm. She found the number. Her hand trembled as she inserted the key. With a deep breath, she pulled open the little door. The box was not empty, but it did not contain a jumble of letters or packages. There was only one thing inside. It was a small, exquisitely detailed wooden model of a bridge. It was an arched bridge, elegant and strong, but it wasn't one she recognized. It was not a bridge Frank had ever built. She lifted it out carefully. It was light, made of balsa wood, and crafted with the loving precision only an engineer could muster. With a deep breath, she pulled open the little door. The box was not empty, but it did not contain a jumble of letters or packages. There was only one thing inside. There was only one thing inside. It was a small, exquisitely detailed wooden model of a bridge. It was an arched bridge, elegant and strong, and as she turned it over in her hands, she saw it. A tiny brass plaque affixed to the underside. On it, 2 lines of engraved text. The Clara May, Mark II, my strongest anchor. Tears blurred her vision. The Clara May was the name he'd given the bridge that won him his award early in his career. This was something else. A new version. A private one. A testament. Beneath the model, a simple, thick manila envelope. Her name was written on the front, in his familiar, slanted handwriting. But it looked shaky, labored, the handwriting of a man fighting against his own body. She clutched the envelope to her chest and walked out of the post office, blinded by tears. She drove home in a daze, the model of the bridge sitting on the passenger seat beside her. A silent testament. Frank was where she had left him, in his armchair, staring out the window at the fiery maple tree. She clutched the envelope to her chest. The model of the bridge sitting on the passenger seat beside her. A silent testament. Beneath the model, lying flat at the bottom of the box, was a simple, thick manila envelope. A silent testament. Beneath the model, lying flat at the bottom of the box, was a flat blueprints, the need, a testament. Beneath the model, lying flat at the bottom of the box, the late afternoon sun cast a golden glow on his silver hair. He looked peaceful, absent. She sat down on the ottoman at his feet, the envelope in her lap. Her hands shook as she opened it. Inside were not just one, but a series of letters and a folder of financial documents. The letters were dated over a period of 5 years. starting from the time his tremors first became noticeable. The last one was dated 3 years ago, right before the darkness had fully descended. With a deep breath, she pulled open the little door. The box was not empty, but it did not contain a jumble of letters or packages. The letters were dated over a period of 5 years, starting from the time his tremors first became noticeable. The last one was dated 3 years ago, right before the darkness had fully descended. The last one was dated 3 years ago, right before the darkness had fully descended. The last one was dated 3 years. She began to read the first letter. His words, a voice from a past she was only just now understanding. My dearest Clara, my hands are shaking today. It's getting harder to control the pen. There you have it. She began to read the first letter. His words, a voice from a past she was only just now understanding. My dearest Clara, my hands are shaking today. It's getting harder to control the pen. A deep breath. She pulled open the little door. The box was not empty, but it did not contain a jumble of letters or packages. The letters were dated over a period of 5 years, starting from the time his tremors first became noticeable. The last one was dated 3 years ago, right before the darkness had fully descended. The last one was dated 3 years ago, right before the darkness had fully descended. The last one was dated 3 years ago, sixed with letters that we had worked for since then. It's getting harder to control a lot of things. The doctor gave it a name, this shaking. Parkinson's. It's a progressive disease, he said. A long, slow decline. I'm writing this because I know a day will come when I can't write anymore, when I can't speak. And there are things I need you to know. Things I was too proud or too foolish or too cowardly to tell you in person. She read on, letter by letter, as the sun set outside the window. He told her everything. He told her about David Vance, the man who fell from the bridge, and the guilt he carried like a stone in his gut. He told her about Genevieve, his first love, and the promise he'd broken, a failure of his youth that had haunted him. He told her about Arthur, and how he'd sacrificed his own reputation to save his friend, a secret he kept to protect her from the fallout. I never told you these things, my love, he wrote in one letter, not to deceive you, but to protect you. You were my sanctuary. Our life together, our home, our daughter, that was the one perfect structure I ever built. I couldn't bear the thought of bringing my own cracks, my own stresses and faults into it. I thought I could keep them contained, manage them on my own. It was the engineer in me. It was my pride. And it was my greatest mistake, because in trying to protect you, I isolated myself, and I shut you out. I am so sorry for that. The financial documents were a shock. For decades, he had been making small, careful investments with a portion of his salary. It was his secret project. He called it in the final letter. The fund had grown, quietly, steadily, over the years. It was now a substantial sum, enough for her to live on comfortably for the rest of her life, enough for her to be free. The last letter was almost illegible, the handwriting a painful scrawl. Clara, the memories are going, slipping away like sand. Sometimes I look at you, and for a second, I can't place you. It's the most terrifying feeling in the world. To lose you while you're still right here. This money, it's for you, for your freedom. When I become a burden, I want you to be able to live, to travel, to see the world we were supposed to see together. Build your own bridge, my love. Don't let my broken one hold you back. All my love, for all of time. Your Frank. The letter fell from her hands. Sobs racked her body, deep. Gut-wrenching sobs of grief and love and profound, heartbreaking understanding. He hadn't been preparing for a secret life. He had been preparing for his own departure. He was an engineer, facing the final structural failure of his own mind and body, and he had spent his last lucid years trying to ensure that the person he loved most in the world would be safe when he was gone. Chapter 8. The bridge between then and now. The room grew dark. The last light of day faded from the sky, leaving only the soft glow of a street lamp filtering through the window. Clara sat on the floor at her husband's feet, the letters scattered around her, a paper mosaic of a life lived in secret devotion. The tears had subsided, leaving behind a profound, hollowed-out calm. She was not the same woman who had discovered a list of addresses on a computer screen a week ago. That woman was suspicious, hurt, afraid. This woman was a custodian, the keeper of a sacred trust. She gathered the letters, her movements slow and deliberate. She looked at Frank. His eyes were open, but his gaze was distant, unfocused. The man who had written these passionate, painful, loving words was trapped somewhere deep inside, behind a wall that no one could breach. But she had to try. She pulled the ottoman closer, took his frail, trembling hand in hers. His skin was thin, like paper. His grip was faint. A mere flutter. "Frank," she said softly. "It's me. It's Clara." There was no response, no flicker of recognition. "I found your letters, my love," she continued, her voice thick but steady. "I know everything. I went on a journey, Frank. I visited your addresses." She started to talk. She told him about Eleanor Vance in Portland and how the Lego sets had given her grandson a world to build. She told him about Genevieve by the sea and how she still wore the locket with the 4-leaf clover. She described Michael Chen's beautiful art gallery in Seattle, a testament to a second chance. She told him about Arthur on the mountain and the truth about the bridge, the truth of Frank's sacrifice. She spoke for over an hour, her voice a low, gentle murmur in the quiet room. She was narrating his life back to him, piece by piece. She was holding up the mirror of his own goodness, hoping a reflection might stir within him. Finally, she picked up the last letter, the one with the shaky, labored script. "And I read this, Frank," she said, her voice catching. "About being free, about building my own bridge." She squeezed his hand. "You foolish, wonderful man. Don't you know? You were never a burden. You are my home." She began to read the last letter aloud to him. Her voice trembled as she read his words about his fading memories, about his fear of losing her. "To lose you while you're still right here." As she spoke those words, she felt it, a faint pressure. His fingers, ever so slightly, tightened around hers. She stopped reading, her breath catching in her throat. She looked at his face. His eyes, which had been so vacant, so lost, seemed to focus. For just a fleeting second, the fog cleared. He was looking at her, truly looking. and in the depths of his eyes, she saw him, her Frank, the man she had loved for 50 years. A single tear escaped from the corner of his eye and traced a slow path down his wrinkled cheek. And then a sound, a hoarse, breathy whisper, the first word he had spoken in months. Clara. The moment was a miracle, a tiny, perfect bridge across the chasm of his illness, connecting the man he was to the man he had been. It lasted only a few seconds. Then, as quickly as it came, the light in his eyes faded. The focus was gone. He was adrift again. But it was enough. He had heard her. He had understood. Clara brought his hand to her lips and kissed it. She was crying again. But these were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of gratitude. She had been given a gift, a final, precious moment of connection. The money, she knew, would go unused. Her journey was over. She had already traveled further than she had ever imagined. Not across continents, but into the vast, uncharted territory of a human heart. Her husband's heart. She would not be building a new bridge. Her purpose was clear now. She would be the anchor for the man who had always been hers. She would sit with him, hold his hand, and tell him the stories of his own life, over and over again. She would be his memory. She would be the custodian of his goodness, the sole living witness to the quiet, magnificent architecture of his love. Outside, the autumn wind rustled the leaves of the maple tree he had planted so long ago. The house was quiet again, but it was no longer a silence of absence or secrets. It was a silence filled with the entire, complete truth of a 50-year love story. And for Clara, it was more than enough. It was everything.